Hello everybody! Welcome to a new video where I'm building a backend application with Spring Boot step by step. In this video, I will show how to use the cookie-based authentication. I will show the difference between using the cookie-based and the JWT authentication, which I've already described in another video. Take your keyboard, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and let's go! I've already added the web configuration to specify the courts, the allowed methods, and headers. Let's start by adding the Spring Security dependency. And now let's add the security configuration. What I will add in the security configuration is an exception handler to return a pretty JSON response instead of stack traces, configure the HTTP filters to handle the cookie-based authentication and the username password authentication, the protected endpoints, and some other basic configuration. But which is the best authentication system, the cookie-based or JWT? What I want using the cookie-based authentication is to be stateless, to avoid having a user session stored in the application, because this way I can hardly handle multiple instances of the same application, and I can't recover the information if my application stops. Using JWT, I store some necessary information in the token, the necessary information to tell the application that the user is correctly connected. And what I will do with the cookie is very similar. I will store a few information to let the application know the user is already authenticated. The JWT has some content, some information, and an encrypted signature with a secret key to ensure the validity of the token. And I will reproduce this behavior with the cookie. I will store some basic information like the login and the user ID and an encrypted signature. So, why use the cookie instead of the JWT? The token can be provided by a third application, can be shared between multiple applications until its end date is reached. On the other hand, when I create the cookie, I can specify on which domain the cookie must be used, and the browser will help me maintain this cookie safe. I know that this cookie won't be used by a third party. Of course, it will be harder to use for SSO, for single sign-on systems, where I need a third-party system to authenticate into the application. In this case, the JWT is the best option. Let's now configure the security of the application. This is to catch the exceptions and return a pretty JSON instead of a stack trace. I add both the user and cookie-based authentication inside HTTP filters. I don't want to create a session as I want a stateless application. And when logout, remove the cookie. Those are the unprotected endpoints. And the rest of the endpoints need the authentication. I will start by creating the entry point, which catches the exceptions. Let's now continue creating the username password filter. This HTTP filter will only catch the request against the signed-in endpoint. Read the login and password information and store it in the security context. I will check its validity later. And call the remaining filters at the end. Let's go now creating the cookie-based filter. I need to name my cookie and look for it. And as before, if it's present, store the value in the security context that I will read later. And very important, call the remaining filters at the end. Okay, but those filters don't have the logic to know if the request is correctly authenticated. I've added some information in the security context, but nothing was validated. Let's now add the authentication provider. This component will read the security context and validate its content to return a complete authentication object with the user information. Let's first inject my authentication service that I will need to validate the authentication information. Here, I will handle the authentication via the username and password. And here, I handle the authentication based on the cookie value, on the cookie token. If I get a user from the previous methods, it means that the incoming information is correctly assigned to an existing user, which means that the request is correctly authenticated, and I can return the user object in the authentication object. I will use it later in the controllers. Let's go now to the authentication service, which checks the credentials, create and validate the token from the cookie. This secret key will be used to create the signature. This method is to check the username password validity. I just check it with a hard-coded password. I should compare it with a stored password per user, but this is beyond the scope of this video. I will create the token as the concatenation of the ID of the user, its login, and a signature. I will use HMAC, which is a hash-based message authentication code. To find a user from a token, I first split the token into 3 parts to get the login or the ID. and validate the signature, otherwise it means that the token doesn't correspond to this user. And here is how I calculate the hash mark. Okay, now I have all the requests authenticated by cookie or by a username and password. But how do I create the cookie? When the authentication is correctly done by username and password, I must create the cookie. The cookie must be created after the user is correctly authenticated with its password. Let's go to the authentication controller. Now that I have the user object in the security context, I can use the following annotation in the controllers. Authentication principal, which will inject the user object in my controller. If I reach this controller and no exception is catched by the entry point, it means that my user is correctly authenticated. So let's create the cookie. One last step, the logout. I must clear the security context and remove the cookie. and I will let the browser delete the cookie. So, all steps done. Let's now see how it works. Here is my cookie with its value. Let's now use it in a request. Here I have my content personalized by the user authenticated. A quick recap. First, the user will try to authenticate via username and password. The request will be intercepted by the HTTP filter. It will start the security context with some incomplete information. Then the authentication provider will validate the password and return the user object. When reaching the controller with the authentication principal annotation, I have access to the user information. I must create the cookie and store the token on it. The cookie is created in the response and returned to the user, to the browser where it will be stored. For the following requests, the cookie will be intercepted by another HTTP filter, which will again fill the security context with some incomplete information. And the authentication provider will validate the token stored in the cookie to return the user object and let the request continue to whatever controller was requested. And in my new controller, if I need the user object, I just need to add the authentication principal annotation. How do you feel? You know now how to use the cookie to authenticate a stateless application. But this must be taken with care, because some browsers handle the cookie in such a way you may not like, or you may have a user which doesn't allow the cookies for your application. I hope you enjoyed the video. I would appreciate a click on the like button and subscribe to my channel to miss no videos like this one. Bye!